All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Modesto Junior College today for an evening with Ana Castillo. This event is sponsored by the Literature and Language Arts, Publicity and Special Events Committee, the Associated Students of Modesto Junior College, and Director Jeff Swank and Dean Jillian Daly, among others. I'm Dr. Theresa Rojas, Professor of English and MJC's first Professor of Ethnic Studies. I'm also the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival, and I will be your moderator tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, who I met years ago when I was a graduate scholar at The Ohio State University. So this is coming full circle for me, and again, a great pleasure. Ana Castillo, in a career spanning 4 decades, novelist, poet, and essayist, Castillo has long been recognized as one of the most articulate, powerful voices in contemporary Chicana literature. Steeped in Chicano tradition and deeply invested in social justice advocacy, Castillo's work transcends boundaries of politics, class, and gender, making her one of a few Mexican-American writers who have attracted the attention of the mainstream reading public. Castillo's novel, The Guardians, traces the lives of Mexican immigrants who illegally crossed the border into the US. Perhaps Castillo's most lauded achievement to date, The Guardians is both intimate and epic, as crushingly relevant today as it was when first published in 2008. More recent books include the Lambda Award-winning Give It to Me, a special edition re-release of her groundbreaking collection, Massacre of Dreamers, essay on Chicanism, and her memoir, Black Dove, essays on Mami, Mijo, and Me. Her latest, My Book of the Dead, is a stunning collection of poetry and artwork that interrogates rage, joy, sorrow, and resilience in the face of societal upheaval. Castillo is currently at work on 2 books, Doña Cleanwell Leaves Home, a collection of short stories, and Isabel 2121, a genre-bending dystopian novel. She has been honored with the Outstanding Latina Cultural Award by the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, a Carl Sandburg Award, a Mountains and Plains Booksellers Award, and fiction and poetry fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts. Again, it's my great pleasure to welcome Ana Castillo.
Good evening, buenas noches. Nice to see you again, Dr. Ramos.
Rojas, I almost said it wrong.
Actually, you have I wanted to say Dr. Theresa, and I said Dr. Ramos, which is
and then I got it wrong.
My doctor friend is Theresa Ramos, so I got it mixed up in my head.
I love it. So it's all good. We got that out. It's in the air now. So let's start. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your origin story as a writer.
Yes, I'll be happy to. You know, we have to frame it, of course, historically in this country. And as a kid growing up in Chicago, this is, of course, before the civil rights movement, before the bilingual education programs that began to, get installed in different places. That was part of my generation's activism, in fact. So I grew up in a time in which, a brown girl with parents who work in a factory and going to a Chicago public school system, she's not really given much attention for anything outstanding, or there's no special tracks. So I wrote and I drew. Drawing was really my first love. I did that on my own. My mother recalled that I started writing as soon as I started writing. I love to read everything and anything. I have a little story that I do share with people because it does stay in my mind as maybe the first times I wrote poetry or thought I was writing something. When I was 8.5 years old, my paternal grandmother passed away, and she'd been like a second mother, and she was my caretaker. Being a child at that time, people weren't really talking, didn't take too much time to explain things to you. So my experience was very internalized. My mother worked in a factory, as I mentioned. She worked on assembly lines. That was where they would place her. In assembly lines, you have to keep up quotas to be able to keep your job. You have to do a certain amount of whatever it is that you're producing per hour. And at this particular factory, she was given a little very crudely put together notepad. I remember it was rough cardboard, very, bad kind of glue that stuck these dark yellow hard pages together. And the only purpose for this was to keep writing your quotas. A foreman, and it was only 4 men, not 4 women, 4 people. 4 men would walk by and pick it up and make sure you're doing your quota. But my mother, knowing that I love to draw, and she would give me the junk mail or scraps of paper, butcher paper from the butcher shop to draw on. She brought this pad home, and this was such a great gift to me because it was like a little drawing pad. But what I began to do was write these small, short expressions of my emotion, what was going on. Why I remember it is because it became a hit at the school playground during recess. I shared it with the other children in my class, the other little kids, and they liked it. They found it very fascinating what I was doing, and they would say, "Hey, write one for me, write one about my grandma," and so on. So I remember that really, that marks the beginning of my my long and exciting writing career.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. So I'm wondering, based on what you've just told us, what is your family's influence on your writing, both in terms of building your writing, but their reaction as family members, putting these stories into the world? How do they react? How do they react?
Well, let's keep in mind that I have been writing a very long time, but I also started writing, as we just talked about it, before such things happened. Such decisions were made. Where do you get this idea of how, why? When both parents would point at each other and say, "What, did she get it from you? Did she get it from you? What is this?" So it was sort of like that. But over time, there were different responses and reactions. And I think many first generation, and I wasn't totally first generation. My father was born in Chicago, but many first generation people understand this. To have a job, you have to be in a concrete building, to have to get credit in your family for doing anything. You have to show proof of that. You have a paycheck, these kind of things that you go and they see, or an office, something like that. But when you're a writer or you're an artist, they really are very worried about you and about your choice. So that was a big part for a long time of my parents, my immediate family's sense of it. And I did what I felt very passionate to do. But my writing really came from a place of my conviction as an activist. I was also working in grassroots organizations and things, and this was a way that I could express myself and get reactions and responses. And you use your language and your knowledge of what you're learning about the world that you've inherited. So this was very important to me, regardless of those reactions. There's a feeling, and it continues to be among people from modest backgrounds, that if you get a book published, you're immediately a millionaire. And so when I had my collection of poetry, my father was a Toltec that came out in 1988. I mean, by then they just thought, I don't know what they think that a publisher that publishes out of his home on a kitchen table gave you as an advance. When I did my first collection, Women Are Not Roses, that came out with Arte Público Press, which was a very brand new press at the time, my father took it to his factory he worked a graveyard shift from midnight to 7. And he was, had a picture of me on the cover and showing it around. And, some guy said to him, oh, your daughter has a book and she's got you working in a factory. So it was difficult for them to understand always and forever till they passed away. And I became, by the time I turned 40, I crossed over to mainstream with my novel, So Far From God. So I was always in the newspaper for a while and on NPR and things like that. But it was sort of, a mixed bag. So, but my conviction to write really comes from this desire to do something, like Pablo Neruda said, we have to do something while we are on this planet. He says in his poem, because we were born neither birds nor dogs. And I feel that birds, dogs, and all creatures do what they have to do, what they're supposed to be doing. So I'm not feeling that so much, but I do feel that we're born on this planet. And if we want to complain about what we inherited, then do something about it. And so that's where I took my creativity and used it most, which was in the writing, regardless of family support or teachers or mentors. Again, in terms of historical framing, there was very little of that as I developed.
I'm so glad that you mentioned So Far From God. That wasn't in your bio, but that is a novel that is particularly close to me. I studied it for my my PhD dissertation, and I've taught it a couple of times. And I love teaching it because students are freaked out by it at first. They're like, what is happening? What they're floating? And I don't know, I thought this kid was dead. They're not dead, And so, but I push them, and I tell them, just keep going. We're going to talk about it. We're going to address your reaction. And it leads to some of the most just fruitful, really interesting discussions. And so I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about So Far From God and kind of its place in your works.
It was my third novel, but it was, in the eyes of the world, the introduction to me as a writer. And I always knew, there's a lot in life that I have had a sense of that it would be that way. So I was writing 20 years before I had this novel that was published by mainstream. It was actually Norton, W.W. Norton, which is still an independent press, but it was still considered, because they're always they're forerunners in literature and so on. And they took a chance on this book and on me. I wrote it in colloquial Northern New Mexico English. I used very freely the Spanish that's used by the Hispano people there, or was historically for a long time. And the way English was spoken, which was very informal. I think the hardest thing for my editor was the double negatives. And then he said, and sometimes there's 3 negatives in the same sentence. So I'm sure your students were asking you about that too. And we didn't italicize the Spanish, which was a colloquial Spanish. And I'm fluent in Spanish, but my Spanish is a Mexican Spanish, which I mostly learned from my mother and of course my relatives. But Northern New Mexico, Southern Colorado Spanish has a uniqueness. It even has some of the Native American words that have blended in over the centuries. And I put my ear to the ground. I was living in Albuquerque, and I put my ear to the ground and I tried my very best to be true to that language and to the culture, which they're like cousins. They're cousins of people from Mexico City and all of us who have experienced Spanish colonialism. So I didn't expect anything for that book. It was like everything else I've written. I write it because I want to, because I need to, because it fascinated me to no end that they called themselves Hispanos. I called myself Chicana, but that they were Chicanos that had real lands, not an apartment or a little house with, gangway like in Chicago and a little backyard, but real land. And they were there 7 generations and they went back forever. They could trace back their family roots. That was like mind blowing, to me. And I wrote it out of admiration and love for the culture. And I have a lot of the culture too. I mean, I was initially brought up as Catholic, and it was very Catholic because of the Spanish conquest. So I'm sure your students, with the whole flying, that what critics, literary critics call magical realism, was nothing more than Catholicism in the book. These are things that if you were Catholic, you believe. Jesus died. He went to hell for 3 days. He resurrected in full body and flesh. Now, you could say that in literature, you could say that's magical realism, or you can say that's faith. And those are the things that came out in that story.
Yeah, just wonderful. And the ability to have those kinds of discussions, and you see the realizations of people going, wait a minute, we tell these kinds of stories and we just kind of believe that these things happened or could happen, but then when they read it in a book, when we read it, it seems almost ridiculous, right? And it's like, wait a minute, let's talk about the kind of stories that we share in our families, and the mysticism and ultimately the religious beliefs. And they're like, oh, how did she? I remember one student saying, how did she know?
Me, the outsider. They think of me as the outsider. I was asked that once. I don't know if it was in Arizona or where it was exactly in the Southwest. And the first question I got was, how do you think that you can connect to the women here? But as you know, my background is a very, very humble one and a very typical one of many people of Mexican origin in this country. My grandparents came here my mother's parents came here in the 20s, and and they were doing okay. He was working on the railroads, as many Mexicans were, and they established themselves in the Midwest, as many Mexicans did, and they had their church and they had their school and they had their nice car, and she had her beautiful hat. I have a picture of her wonderful life. 1929 stock market crash, and then we have what we're talking about now, or the repatriations of Mexico, where approximately 1 million Mexican people and their American-born children were deported to Mexico. And this is what happened with my grandparents, and my mother, who was born in the Midwest as an infant, was taken to Mexico, deported, although she's a US citizen, and grew up in Mexico as a result of that kind of treatment that we have. And we all share those stories. So of course I connect with them. I don't have to have been born in New Mexico or have been born in California or in Texas to have those connections. Our migration stories all connect us at some point.
I think also another connective tissue is the language, right? And the way that you navigate language is just so beautiful throughout these works, particularly those of us who are bilingual. But I've noticed that even my students who don't speak Spanish necessarily, they get it. There's something about the flow. There's something about the construction that they're able to catch on. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, about your navigation of language in your work?
Well, I'll say about So Far From God, again, that was published by W.W. Norton. I was respected for the use of the double and triple negatives in a sentence, and also my insistence on not ever italicizing any of the Spanish. And it was colloquial Spanish. I mean, right away, somebody writes to the editor and said, well, she's got it wrong, it's misspelled. And it's the way people speak. But the reason, my argument, which was respected and accepted by the publisher, why we were not going to italicize is because of the treaty that the US and Mexico have, the Treaty of Guadalupe of 1868, actually guaranteed to the Hispano people of the areas their retainment of their language, which was Spanish. They were supposed to be able to keep their language. We are at a time now in which we've all heard and experienced about censorship. I certainly know that in my mother's generation, of course, where Spanish is not allowed at your workplace and so on. So there's a needed politic for this. And I'll use a word that's very strong. It's a very strong word, and I don't throw out language easily like that. I've given it a lot of consideration, but it's a kind of a apartheidist situation, especially in previous generations for Mexican people in the U.S. So it was a politic to use Spanish. When I decided to be a political writer, a poet, I chose to write in English because I'm a US-born American Mexican. I just explained a little bit of my background and why I'm born here and what's happened. The freedom that my mother had as a US citizen to come back and forth. Although if you had met her, she never spoke English and you would never have thought that she was a US citizen, but she had every right to be here and be there because she had been deported over there. So to me, using English, because I was coming out of a generation where we were not allowed to speak Spanish in school, where we did not have any idea about bilingual education, we created that what has now become a polemic. And so I chose to write in English, but I used the language that we used every day. But we don't all use Spanish and English the same way. Also, other Latino groups don't use English and Spanish the same way. That's been a challenge for me as a writer that I have found very fascinating. And I just talked about the one that I took with Northern New Mexico, because there were words that I knew in Spanish that were said differently or spoken differently. And I would ask people around me and say, would you say this? And do you ever use this word? I mean, we're not one homogeneous community. And so I've tried my best as a writer to be respectful of those differences. But my main objective has been on silencing a brown woman who was born in a time in this country in which very little was expected of her. So I want you to see who she is. You see that in So Far From God and in my poems and in The Guardians. They're different women. And now my forthcoming collection of stories, Doña Cleanwell Leaves Home, I've centered on all kinds of women in the US and in Mexico over the last few decades, having different consciousness about that, how they're coming to it in their own quiet lives.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your poetry, and I would love to take a moment right now, if you wouldn't mind sharing a poem with us.
Yes, I'll be happy to. I have a poem, and this is from the new book, my Book of the Dead, that came out with University of New Mexico Press last fall. A poem here that, in fact, was dedicated to the native Chicano poet John Trudell upon the passing of his death, his crossing over. John Trudell, if you don't know about him, you should look him up. He was also a performer. He had a band and he performed his poetry. And he gave his life for his convictions. And he gave also, he sacrificed, not that he gave it, but some of our greatest sacrifices that we can when we are political activists. You give your life. What about if they came for your children? What if they came for your husband, your wife, your loved one? What would you do? And so he experienced all of that. And so I have great admiration for him and people like him. It's called A Storm Upon Us. And I wrote it in 2015. A storm is coming. It is on the horizon. It has traveled far, fast, wide, and taken much in tow, the storm. Infused with lies and nitrogen, water, air, ground, infused our fruit and animals infused, our minds infused with lies and nitrogen. We're dumbstruck, believe ourselves smart when we are instead confused. The tricksters counted on our being caught unawares. They knew our selfishness, greed, most of all, fears. The storm approaches. Can you hear it? 999 hoof-like vibrations beat against our eardrums, and we remain indifferent. We have our things gathered. Our children seem fine. We always rebound. The storm comes and goes, returns. Next time harder. We don't even bother with shelters. We give it new names each time. Further fire and rain, we mourn. We start again. It could have been you or me, we say, dying in public, beneath a baton's blows, falling in the spray of a sniper's bullets, but it wasn't. We go on. Disaster has happened to someone else. We venture out and buy more. We take more. We discard. We pillage the earth. The storm takes sinister forms. Go by isms, neo and post hyphenations. Be afraid, leaders of the faceless enemy warn. Beware, be aware. When you travel, we cannot protect you. We will be vigilant of your whereabouts. Our watchful eye will know your life. Long lines to survive, much less thrive, lie before you. You'll feel shame like in naked dreams, but worse, because we in fact are watching you. We will make sure you don't question. And when the storm is upon you, when it has destroyed your homes and your children are not fine, and your dreams of golden roses and bright days are nowhere but in the pages of a storybook, we will be content in our heavens, eating peeled grapes, sipping fine wines from our vineyards of abundance, sitting on our thrones, new gods will smile down upon you, our creation of ruin, pick our teeth with your bones. Thank you.
Wait, I need a moment. That was just phenomenal. I feel like I want to let it linger in the air for a moment. It's been a minute, and listening to that read out loud is just gorgeous.
Thank you.
I'm refraining from swearing right now, but I really want to.
Thank
You do something that is so beautiful that not all writers do, or not all writers can do well, and that is to navigate between prose and poetry and an essay form. And could you talk to us a little bit about that experience, not just the creative process, but how that differs in building creative energy across those forms?
Well, first I have to clarify that I am not a writer out of a creative writing program or English major or Spanish or lit and language major. I was an art student. And so, as my mother said, I started writing since I was this big. And so I wrote on my own. And I had a great deal of freedom to write naively, if you will, at times, whatever and however I needed to write. Having said that, I was always a voracious reader. My teachers were writers that I enjoyed reading, that brought me into their work. And so that's how I learned to write each genre. When I chose to be a poet, I told myself that in order to be a good poet, this is all that I could do. I couldn't draw, I couldn't paint, I couldn't write stories, or even though I had written stories again as a kid, and I don't think I was afraid of writing stories, but I felt like I have to and I didn't have the language for it, but I think I was thinking I have to develop my craft. And so I wrote poetry for only poetry for about 8 years. And it's proven to be a wonderful foundation for the rest of my writing, because what it does teach you to do is to be very, very appreciative of language. My transition was my first novel, which is called The Miskewala Letters. The Miskewala Letters was published in mid-'80s and has been in print for 36 years. It's with Doubleday Publishers now. And I had no clue that it would get published by anybody, or how anybody would read it or see it, except that it was a story I wanted and needed to write. And the transition from poetry to fiction, and much less a novel, is very daunting, you know. And I must have written several versions of it before I got the format that it has, which is an epistolary. So it's told in letters, but very different kind of storytelling. It has options for various endings. All of this I'm doing because I just feel like I want to be challenged. I admired writers like from the Latin American boom so much that I wanted to write like that, but I needed to write. And so I went to fiction. Now, some years go by and my poetry and my fiction is being now read around the country and in Europe and in Mexico. But people want to know, who is this person that calls herself a Chicana? Who is this identity? Who is this demographic that they call themselves Chicanas? And there's a few of them. And so I was challenged to write nonfiction, write the critical essay, and I had to teach myself. That's really, it still remains to be the hardest genre for me. And I read a lot of books of essays. I read Edward Said, I read Carlos Fuentes and Adrian Rich, one of my favorites is James Baldwin. I knew about them. I was reading for how you get that idea across. How do you get the rhetoric across, the debate? And so every time that I go to a new genre, there's a reason, and the reason is always the same. I want people to know who we are. And if I have to so not everybody that reads poetry is going to read fiction. Not everyone that reads essays is interested in poetry. And you'll see the same stories coming up in the different genres. And all the while, each time, the challenge presented itself to me to learn how to actually have control of it.
So what does that mean exactly? I love this line that you just said, that you want to show people who we are, and so you're writing in these different genres. But what does that mean? If I could just dig a little deeper there, what does it mean to show people who we are?
I was thinking recently, I mentioned before we started recording that I had the great honor recently to be inducted in my hometown in Chicago, in the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. We have another inductee there, who I also, of course, knew and was friends with, was reading with, and part of the camaraderie of my generation out of Chicago, who is Sandra Cisneros. And I remember in our early years of reading in public, and for a while we had, because there are so few of us and we're pursuing the same things, we would be invited not only around our city, but around the country and elsewhere to read together. And so, but everywhere that you would go, there would be how they would introduce Chicana writers at that time was, there'd be something like 4 Chicanas in search of their identity, two Chicanas looking for their identity. And we laughed about it. So I was just thinking, because recently I was asked all these different questions, and it made me laugh. And I remembered when she said, we were in a hallway at a university, and she said, there it is again, four Chicanas looking for their identity. We knew our identity. We were very confident of our identity. We were asserting our identity, expressing our identity, educating people about our identity with full confidence of who we were. We weren't looking for, well, who am I? I know who I am. I know who I am in my home, and I know who I am in the world, but you don't know who I am when you see me on the street. You don't know who I am when I'm sitting in your classroom, but I know who I am. And so that's what I meant, is it was very important to give voice to that person. Even initially, the Chicano writers that were publishing, like for as an example, Tomas Rivera and Rudy Anaya, wonderful, accomplished writers, they didn't know who the woman was. They thought they did because they had an idea of the mother figure or the wife or the girlfriend, but they didn't really know who we are. And there's still an argument that we can have about that, because if you don't really have a chance to, as I did, to read the words of white writers and white male writers, I get to know them. Audre Lorde said, we know a lot more about the master than the master knows about us. And that's very true. But they don't know who we are. There's assumptions. And if they have an assumption about a brown or a black man, they have no clue about a brown and a black woman. We have to tell them. And so this is what I meant was, it's still, the Doña Cleanwell Leaves Home stories are very modest stories. They're just, everyday women. But they're women that I have known and I have been a part of, little bits of me and other people. And I don't know how much people have stopped to think about their lives, who they are in their households, and who they are as mothers going to work every day, who they are as daughters that don't talk to their fathers, Mm-hmm. So that's what I meant.
Me adivinaste. I was going to ask next about Doña Cleanwell Leaves Home and ask you to tell us a little bit more about that book, because it's a current project, right?
Yes, I'm working on a story. Maybe it'll be one of the last stories. They are unpublished stories. Nobody has read them. Obviously, my new editor has read them. That's how she accepted the book. 2 or 3 people. My new agent, of course, read it. That's how she accepted the book. But I started writing them very sort of quietly in the last couple of years. I was challenging myself. Let me see. I had gotten very, very depressed and very dispirited about where we are in this country and in this world in the last 5-6 years. And I actually had decided not to write anymore. I did feel very strongly, I always felt, and I said it tonight and I'll say it again, my purpose, I felt in my own humble little way, was to contribute what might make this world more just. And I took it as a personal failure when I saw the direction we were going in the last 5 or 6 years. And I thought, well, I came all this way just to get to where we are. And so writing the poems and then extending, just like I did at the beginning of my writing life, expanding them, the stories. And now can I write 5 pages? Can I write 10 pages, 20 pages, 30 pages? I like that. I thought, well, okay, this works. It seems it's nice. I like getting into that world. I like writing. Let me write another one. And so I picked stories about relationships in our families, the difficult relationships of mothers and daughters is a theme in Doña Cleanwell, and how mothers might feel about their sons, and why they get married, and their relationships with other women. There's a story about a woman who has 2 housekeepers in Mexico City. And their relationship is in the background, but it's there. It's always there, how they're part of that household. How we help each other or don't help each other, gender differences, how there may be assumptions that traditional Mexican women don't know anything about what's going on with the transgender movement today, but there's very little that we can invent that hasn't been dealt with in our lives and in society for a very long time. And so as I said, the stories take place over the past decades, and they touch on all these subjects.
You mentioned the difficult relationships between mothers and daughters, and that's something that's very close to my own heart, as I had a very difficult relationship with my own mother, who passed in 2017 from pancreatic cancer. And it wasn't until she passed that I was able to write about her, about our experiences, about our relationship. And my sisters always say, well, you know, she would be very angry to read these things, but at the same time, she would pick up this little chapbook and say, well, you know, I'm the star of this book, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way to look at it. Yes, exactly. And instead, you know, in our families, when we publish, I taught a memoir for 10 years to the public, and not only in this country, but in other countries. And I mean, the stories that people have to tell. But one of the fears is, what if my mother reads this? What if my ex reads this? What if my children read this? Blah, blah, blah. Everybody worries about that. But, you know, my standard, and I said this to my own family when they confronted me, not even about a memoir, but about my poetry. I said, well, it's my book, not your book. It's my story, not your story. And if they're so concerned, they can write their own story. Memories are very tricky anyway. It's not as if you're making stuff up to hurt somebody, but you're really searching for the truth. And that's what the objective reader is looking for. They're not looking for whether, did this really happen to her when she was 5 years old? They're interested in, what are you making of that memory? So that's a good way to look at it. My tia, who passed away in 2018, who's come up in my memoirs and things, she said, you know, Mija, I just love the fact that you've immortalized me. And, you know, that's another way to look at it. It's you know, you can say, well, it's a privilege. I had a wonderful Chicano poet friend was friends with lots of people, the beat poets. He's sort of become more famous after death. And I said the same thing to him when my book of short stories, Lover Boys, came out. I said, you know, there's all these people that are claiming to be the lover boys in my stories. And he said, you know, that's the problem with people. They think they're real. You know, and that's so true. It's like, why do we take ourselves so seriously?
I love that so much, because in this same chapbook, I have what I like to call stories about boys. And so they're interspersed among the poetry about my mom and then illustrations. And so people like to guess, you know, oh, is this so and so? Is that so and so? Or even more sort of scandalous, but is that one about me? And I'm like, it's about you. Get out of here.
Yeah, I did hear. Yes, I heard that several times in Chicago. And one boyfriend that I had when I was a kid in high school, and didn't see him in the rest of my life. So now I'm in my 40s, and he came to my reading and he said his wife said that was him in my book. So I mean, they're just trying to claim a little bit of that stardust that they think you have. And so
I love that.
It's irritating, but I love my friend Ronnie Burke's remark about people thinking they're real, because he in fact was a character in that collection. There was 2 stories in there, and he knew. I mean, I didn't even pretend. I didn't hide him in the story, because he was such a wonderful character. And when you understand literature, you appreciate it. Okay, it's going to happen. You know, if you're with the writer, it's going to happen. So.
Yep, that's I love that as a warning, right? If you're with a writer, it's going to happen. Just so you
know, happen. So just you know,
represented somehow. And I like to throw out the idea of, well, maybe it's either an amalgam, or, you know, a fantasy, or maybe there are all these different people and personas, but we get to represent them as the writers in whatever way we choose. And if you see yourself, in particular, if you see yourself in a character who's an asshole, then what does that say about you? You know, sorry. I
don't know. I don't think of it that way, because my characters, in fiction, you do have the great ability to make composites of people and also to embellish. That's what makes it a greater story than what actually happened. And, sometimes people in your workshops and classes will say, that really happened. And, that's not the important thing about an anecdote or a story or a memory. It's how you tell it. So then you have a sibling call you up and say, that's not how it happened. You're not writing a report. You're not a journalist. You're a fiction writer. You're a poet. So that's at the end of the day, the success is really on people sitting there and being entertained. That's what the writing is for. We may not think of ourselves as entertainers, but if you thinking of yourself as a reader, if you open a book, let's say I say to you tonight, you must read such and such book. Oh, well, she recommended it, must be good. And then you open it up and you can't get past the first page. That's up to you. You put it away. It didn't entertain you. It wasn't teaching you. It wasn't enlightening you. There's different ways that we connect to a book. And if you don't connect with it, then okay. And that, as a reader, you can do that too. So, whether it was true, whether this wonderful or terrible thing happened to me when I was 8 years old, it really doesn't matter. What matters is what the reader thinks.
I think I just like the scandalo, the possibilities of the scandalo, people making up things,
About somebody. Yeah,
right.
going around saying, well, it's going to happen.
I'm just going to say that from now on. Well, it's going to happen.
Or better yet, take out a little notepad when you're in the middle of an argument with your partner, with your spouse, or your mother passed away, but with your sister, somebody at home, and you say, okay, can we replay it? What did you say?
How do you spell that? Okay.
I'm taking notes here.
I like it. I like
my
it.
Next book.
That leads me to the question that we get a lot from students as they're building narratives, whether we're teaching creative writing, whether we're teaching English or sociology, anything where they have to write a narrative of any sort, and they get not just stuck, not just, oh, I have writer's block, but this self-doubt that eats away at, I would say, at some point, at all creatives at some point, but students in particular who are constantly evaluating their own work before they finish the work, right? Before they're really, before they have something to even critique. So I wonder how you deal with, or what you would say to folks who are grappling with a lot of self-doubt in their creative energy.
We all have self-doubt, and I can guarantee you, including myself, I can guarantee you that every single writer, author of a book at a Barnes and Nobles or wherever they're reading at, with front of an audience in an auditorium, I guarantee you they have self-doubt even as they're reading the words that were published. It comes with the territory. But at the very start, somehow you push your way through that to get the book. But when I was doing my memoir writing workshops, I would open up by addressing those very things. We have inner critics and inner censors you always have you have these voices. You have your 6th grade teacher that would circle everything with a red pen. You have the rhetoric teacher in college that's telling you don't speak English, you don't write English. We have them, they're real people. Or you have siblings who did better in school, or you have a parent that makes you. We get the criticism from all kinds of places, and we have to exercise them. I refer to Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. She has an essay there in which she shared this same weekly trauma, writing a weekly review of a restaurant. This was a very long time ago. She was beginning to struggling with her writing and so forth. And she would do a restaurant review once a week. And every week she would have that same panic. You're a terrible writer. What are you doing? Who do you think you are? A little quick exercise and you name them. First, you got to say, who is that talking in my head? It could even be you, but what you do is you visualize them, you shrink them down to the size of a pickle. You've got this big pickle jar by the side of your desk. I know if you read the book, you know, you take them and you throw them in there. You say, okay, Mom, you're going in there. And you put them in there. Then when you finish, you seal up that jar and then you start writing. Leave them in there, kicking and screaming and banging on the glass door until you finish. That's one way. And it sounds kind of cute and hysterical, I'm sure, but it doesn't work. But we did that around the room and around the table in my workshops. And many of us had many of the similar censors and critics. We had society, we had religion, institutions, you know, all, sometimes they weren't people. It's the society that's telling you, you can't write and why are you doing this? And we had to talk about it a little bit. So it's very good. It's very healthy to exercise, but exercising one time might not be enough. You might have to do it every time you sit down to get that voice out of your head. For me, since I work alone and I've always worked alone, and how I taught myself to write was always alone, and I didn't have people around me. Well, yes, there was Sandra, but she was off at the writer's workshop. I met her when she came back, and then we were both poets, you know, me coming from here and her coming from that. So we weren't exactly saying, can you do this? We were at a place in which you say, I'm going to do this. So we had a different origins and process about how to do it. So for me to be able to say that to myself, I had to say, this is why I'm doing this. I have to do it however I'm doing it for this reason. Otherwise, you know, why am I here? So you give yourself a sense of purpose for it. Now you know I'm here. However I speak English, however I write my English or my Spanish, it's because of this experience that I've had.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were made to feel ashamed of our Spanish in this country, but we were also made to feel ashamed of our English. But we made it work. We've all made it work. And so now we have a whole literature of bilingual writers that are still grappling psychologically with it, but it is now a literature. It's now real to talk about it.
Such important ideas here, the claiming, you know, claiming what you want to write, claiming your story, but then also that little side bit of humor, but very serious, the idea of exorcise your pickle. I can't wait to tell my students that.
Remember, you look it up in the book. It's funny and it's always worked. And then people start to say, yeah, me too. I'm throwing my mother in there, you know. So we share a lot of that, but we don't talk about it.
Yeah. I think this is a good pause point. And if you wouldn't mind to read us another piece.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I wanted to share a poem that I wrote. It was on Valentine's Day a few years ago. And it's about the students in Parkland, Florida, who lost their lives to this horrific epidemic of killing, cowardly killing in this country. I wrote it in Spanish. As I mentioned, I sometimes write in Spanish, and I'll start by reading it in Spanish. Gotas caían en el techo. Tic, 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 tic. Una puñalada en el pecho del país. Y la noche no pestañaba ese San Valentín. Un tic, tic, tic caía en el techo y nadie dormía, ni yo, ni mi amor, ni el perro. Con las noticias del último masacre, 17 hijos perdieron sus vidas, alumnas, poetas, líderes del futuro, fueron 17 almas esa vez. 17, cuéntalos en sus ataúdes, que nunca llegaron a su madurez. 17 hijos e hijas, cuenta si se puede, las lágrimas de los padres y del pueblo. El terrorismo doméstico con tanta frecuencia en un lugar que se llama democracia. Ha hecho la muerte banal. Empezó hace siglos atrás, hombres con armas, odiosos de la humanidad, amantes del poder. Ahora se quitan la máscara, el disfraz, con la bendición del señor presidente. Tic, 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 caían las lágrimas del cielo y nadie dormía, ni yo, ni mi amor, ni el perro. I put the word out. I don't like to translate my own work because I feel I fall into the tendency of wanting to write a whole new poem. And so I put the word out for volunteers. Who surprised me, because I didn't know that he spoke English, was the Pulitzer Prize Pulitzer Prize poet, Tahimba Jess, whom I had met previously, who had been in Chicago and is now in New York, who volunteered. He said, I'd like to give it a try. And this is his translation. Drops fell on the roof is the title. Tick, 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 tick. A stab in the chest of the country. And the night didn't blink that Valentine's Day. A tick, tick, tick fell on the roof, and no one slept, not my love, not the dog, not me. With the news of the latest massacre, 17 children lost their lives. Students, poets, leaders of the future. It was 17 souls that time. 17, count them in their coffins that will never grow older. 17 sons and daughters. Count, if you can, the screams of their parents and the people. Domestic terrorism so rampant in a place that calls itself democracy, that has made death banal. It began centuries ago. Men with weapons, haters of humanity, lovers of power. Now they take off their masks, their costumes, with the blessings of Mr. President. Tick, 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 drops fell from the sky, and nobody slept. Not my love, not the dog, not me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I want to end with the opportunity for you to have the last word as far as what would you like to share? What would you like folks to know about anything?
First of all, thank you very much for this evening and for allowing me to speak to your students. I do want them to know that when I graduated from high school, it was considered a girls, they call it a girls commercial high school, where I was supposed to be working in an office. And I had these great ambitions for my extreme politics, but nothing else. I didn't want to be in an office. And so by September of that year, I went downtown and I signed up at the junior college. And so my first 2 years of school were in the Chicago junior college system. Then I moved over to the state college. Recently, I was greatly honored with their alumni award, for which is the highest honor that they give. Again, very quiet art students, but then little quiet rabble rouser. And I've moved from there to each place. And so I don't want anyone who's listening, anyone at your school and anyone in this audience to ever think that their voice is too small, or a voice that will not be heard, or that their opinions or the passion that they have for justice in this world is not going to be heard by them. They will find a way to do it. And now, especially with social media, you can do it, but don't jump in with everybody, with everyone where they don't know who you are. There's ways to do it and you will find that way. But the important thing for me is that you do it. And so that's what I want to share. Please find me on social media. I am on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter. I don't I'm not there like crazy all the time, but that's me that answers you. That's me that comments. If you send me an email, that will be me answering you. Please don't think that, that I have somebody else doing all of that. I do that, and I also wash my own dishes and walk my own dog. So just so you know, nobody's writing my books at this point. So that's the glamorous life of a political poet and Chicana novelist.
Oh, Ana Castillo, it's been such a pleasure. Congratulations on the
Thank
getting
you.
inducted into the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame.
Thank you.
I cannot thank you enough for being with us today virtually at Modesto Junior College. Thank you to our YouTube audience. We had quite an audience saying lots of nice things. And as I always say to everyone, create the stories that you want to see in the world.